The smell of pine and roasted meat hit me the second I stepped into my parents' house in Hartford, Connecticut. Christmas always smelled the same there, like effort layered over tension. The foyer looked perfect, wreath centered on the mirror, red ribbon wrapped tightly around the banister, framed family photos lining the wall in careful order. Anyone walking in would have thought this was a warm house, a safe house, the kind where people forgave each other before dessert. I was 31 that Christmas, and I remember how heavy the pie dish felt in my hands. Pumpkin, from the bakery Mom preferred, even though I never liked how sweet they made it. I brought it anyway. In our family, following up without something to offer was seen as a small failure, and I had learned long ago not to give anyone an excuse to look down on me. My heels clicked against the hardwood as I stepped inside. The sound echoed more than it should have. Laughter drifted from the dining room, but it was thin, stretched too tight. I knew that sound. It was the sound people make when they are performing happiness for an audience. The dining room was already full. Candles flickered along the center of the long table, their light reflecting off crystal glasses and white plates with the holy pattern we only used in December. David sat at the head of the table, straight-backed, composed, wearing a navy sweater that looked effortless and expensive. Mom hovered nearby, smoothing napkins, adjusting place cards, moving the way she always did when she was anxious, but pretending she was fine. My sister Lila was there too. Cream-colored dress, hair perfectly styled, posture relaxed. She looked like she belonged exactly where she was. When her eyes met mine, they slid away almost immediately, as if she had already finished this conversation in her head. That was the first moment I felt the quiet certainty settle in my chest. Something had already been decided. There were people at the table who were not family. My aunt and uncle, yes, a couple of cousins, but also two men I recognized from company events. Men who wore suits even at casual gatherings and spoke carefully, always measuring their words. And then there was the woman standing near the sideboard, dressed in red, speaking quietly with Dad. I recognized her instantly, our family attorney. I had seen her enough times in conference rooms and closed-door meetings, too. Know that she only appeared when things were about to become official. My stomach tightened, but I kept my face neutral. I took my seat halfway down the table, exactly where my place card told me to sit. Not close enough to the head to matter, not far enough to disappear. The silverware was lined up perfectly, the napkin folded with precision. The entire setup felt less like a family dinner and more like a boardroom, in disguise. Before anything else happens, let me ask you something. What are you doing right now while you listen to this story? Are you washing, dishes, driving home, sitting quietly with a cup of coffee? For me, I was standing in my parents' dining room, trying to breathe like this was just another Christmas. If you have ever felt that shift in a room right before something breaks, you know exactly what I mean. Dinner began the way it always did, with small talk and careful smiles. My aunt talked about church events. One of the men from the company praised a recent warehouse expansion. Lila laughed softly at the right moments. Mom kept glancing at Dad, waiting for him to lead the conversation, as she always did. Dad took his time. He always did when he was about to assert control. He cut his roast slowly, chewed deliberately, let the room settle into a false sense of normal. I watched his hands. Steady. Confidence. The hands of a man who believed he owned the room. Then he set his fork down. The sound was small, but it cut through the noise like a signal. Conversation stopped immediately. Mom froze with her glass halfway to her lips. The company men straightened in their chairs. Lila lowered her eyes. Dad folded his hands together and looked directly at me. Tara, he said, my name sounding more like a conclusion than a greeting. Before we move on, there is something we need to address. Mom tried to speak. Graham, she said softly, but Dad lifted one hand and she stopped. That simple gesture silenced the room. It always had. I felt my pulse slow instead of race. This was not panic. This was recognition. I had been watching meetings happen without me for weeks. I had seen calendar invites disappear. I had noticed how people avoided saying my name at work, like it had suddenly become dangerous. Dad continued, his voice calm, measured. I have spent decades building this company and protecting our family name. That requires difficult decisions when stability is threatened. He did not say anything about my decisions. He did not have to. He nodded toward the woman in red. Ms. Sloan is here tonight to formalize some changes. The word changes landed heavy in my chest. Effective immediately, Dad said. You are being removed from the executive roster at McAllister Supply Group. Your authority to make decisions on behalf of the company is revoked. You will no longer represent us to clients, vendors, or partners. A sharp inhale came from my aunt. Someone dropped a fork. The sound echoed. Mom whispered, "Not tonight, please." But Dad did not look at her. You have exposed the company to unnecessary risk, he continued. There has been reputational damage, contract damage, financial damage. He spoke in general terms, the way he always did when he wanted others to fill in the blanks with their own fears. I looked at Leela. She did not look back. Her eyes stayed on her plate, her expression neutral. She was not shocked. She was waiting. Dad slid a thick folder across the table toward me. The paper was heavy, embossed, unmistakably legal. From this point forward, he said, you no longer represent this family in any legal or professional capacity. You will not use our name. You will not claim our support. We are cutting ties. The word cutting settled into the room like dust. Mom covered her mouth with her napkin. Her shoulders trembled, but she stayed seated. She did not stop him. I did not touch the folder. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I was too busy understanding what this really was. This was not anger. This was not a disappointment. This was strategy. I had seen my name appear on documents where it did not belong for years. Risk summaries, responsibility statements, always accountable, never authorized. At the time, I thought it meant trust. Standing there, I finally understood it meant preparation. You are disowning me on Christmas, I said quietly. Dad met my eyes without flinching. I am protecting what I built. Lila glanced up for just a moment. There was relief there, chief and distance. I turned to Mom. Mom, I asked, are you okay with this? She opened her mouth, closed it again. Her silence answered me. Dad tapped the folder once. Sign it. Make this clean. I shook my head. No. The table went completely still. Then we will do this in court, Dad said evenly. The word court was meant to scare me. It did not. It confirmed everything. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood. I refused to give him a seine. I think you wanted witnesses, I said. You got them. Dad began to rise. Sit down, he said sharply. I did not. I looked at Mom one last time, hoping against reason that she would stand. She did not. I walked out of the dining room, past the candles, the crystal, the carefully framed memories. I grabbed my coat from the hall closet. The front door felt colder than I expected when I opened it. Winter air rushing in, sharp and clean. Dad called after me. You will regret this. I turned back once. If you want a courtroom, I said calmly, I will show up, but I will not be the one unprepared. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. Standing on that porch, my breath fogging in the cold, something inside me settled. I was not blindsided. I was not broken. I had been positioned, and now that I could see the board clearly, I knew exactly how this game was going to be played. I sat in my car with both hands on the steering wheel, staring at the warm glow leaking through my parents' front windows like it was, coming from someone else's life. The house behind me looked peaceful, decorated, and perfect. Inside, they were probably passing the potatoes and acting like nothing had happened. Like I was a topic they could close with a napkin fold and a sip of bourbon. The cold air seeped through the door seals. I turned the heat on, but it took a while to catch up. That delay felt familiar. In my family, comfort always arrived late, if it arrived at all. I could have driven anywhere, a friend's place, a hotel, back to my apartment across town. Instead, I sat there and let my mind go where it always went when Dad tried to control the narrative. Back. 8 years earlier, I was 23, wearing a blazer I bought on clearance, sitting at a conference table that smelled like lemon polish and old power. It was the first time Dad invited me into what he called leadership, not the family dinners where you were expected to smile. Real leadership, the kind with spreadsheets and legal pads and people who spoke in short sentences to sound important. It was a Tuesday morning in early spring. I remember because the air outside still had that stubborn bite, and I walked into the office thinking, this might be the moment everything changed. I had been working at McAllister's Supply Group for almost a year, starting in operations, doing the unglamorous things nobody wanted to do: inventory audits, vendor calls, fixing dispatch errors. I was good at it, not because I loved it, but because I hated feeling helpless. Dad stood at the head of the table, exactly where he always stood. Mom was not in that room. She never was when business was discussed. Lila was there, of course, sitting to Dad's right like she had been born in that chair. She was 27 at the time, and already treated like an heir. She had the right laugh, the right friends, the right ease with our biggest clients. People liked her. People always liked Lila. David looked at me as I took my seat, and for a moment, his expression softened. Not warmth exactly, more like approval you might give a dog for not barking. "Tara," he said, "we are going to start involving you in higher-level decisions." I remember how my chest tightened with something like hope and how I hated myself for it. I had spent my whole childhood trying to earn moments like that. I told myself I was past it. I told myself I was an adult now, but a part of me still wanted Dad to look at me like I mattered. He slid a stack of papers across the table. On top was a title that made my stomach flip: Responsible Executive Designation. I did not know what that meant. Not really, but it sounded important. And Dad knew the power of a phrase that sounded official. "This is standard," he said. "It is just paperwork. We need consistency on certain accounts. Sign where it's marked." I looked down at the page. My name was typed neatly in the section that said, Responsible Executive for several client contracts. Big ones. Logistics networks. Hospital suppliers. Municipal accounts. The kind of clients that came with strict oversight and strict consequences if anything went wrong. I hesitated, scanning the lines, feeling my skin prickle. Dad did not like hesitation. He liked obedience that looked like confidence. "David," I said carefully, "what exactly does this make me responsible for?" He waved a hand, dismissing the question as if it were an annoying fly. "It means you are part of leadership. It means your name is on the documents instead of floating around in drafts. It is a formality." Lila smiled without showing teeth. She had a way of watching me that made me feel like I was always about to embarrass myself. I looked at the signature line again. It did not feel like a formality. It felt like a hook. I signed. I told myself it was a step forward. I told myself Dad would not put my name on something that could hurt me. That was the lie I still wanted to believe back then. After that, things shifted, but not the way I expected. I was invited to more meetings, but my role was strange. I would sit there, listening to people discuss budgets and strategy, and when I spoke, the room would go quiet in a way that made my skin tighten. Not because they were listening, because they were tolerating me. I would ask questions about spending on certain accounts, and Dad would answer with half sentences, like he was humoring a child. Lila would jump in with confident explanations that sounded polished but thin, like wrapping paper with nothing inside. And the finance director, a quiet man named Ken, would avoid my eyes whenever I asked about numbers that did not add up. It took me a while to understand that being invited into the room did not mean I had power in it. The first real warning came that summer. We had a client issue, a missed delivery that triggered penalties. It was the kind of problem that would usually be handled by operations, which was my world at the time. I came in early, dug into the logs, found where the breakdown happened, and fixed it. I wrote a report and sent it up the chain. 2 weeks later, Ken stopped by my desk. He did not sit down. He stood there holding a folder like it was hot. "Tara," he said, "I need you to sign this acknowledgement." It was a compliance form tied to that missed delivery. It listed the incident, it listed the penalties, and it listed the responsible executive. Me. I stared at it, my throat tightening. I was not the one who approved the schedule changes that caused the delay. I was not the one who chose the vendor. I was not the one who signed off on the final dispatch plan. I had not even been copied on the email chain where the decision was made. "Ken," I said, "why is my name on this?" He looked at the floor. "It is just how it is set up," he said. "Your name is on the account." But why? I pressed, feeling heat rise in my face. Who put it there? Ken's mouth tightened. You should talk to your dad. That sentence, you should talk to your dad, sounded simple, but it was a closed door, because talking to Dad about anything he had already decided was not a conversation. It was a lesson, and the lesson was always that I was overreacting. I walked into Dad's office later that day. He was on the phone, laughing, relaxed, as if nothing in the world could touch him. He waved me in without covering the receiver. I held the compliance form up. David, I said, why am I listed as a responsible executive on this penalty? He covered the phone with his hand, eyes narrowing slightly. Because you are responsible, he said. You are part of leadership now. Learn to carry weight. I felt my stomach drop. I did not cause this, I said. I did not approve the decision. David leaned back in his chair and studied me like he was deciding whether I was worth the time. You are asking the wrong question, he said. The question is whether you want to be taken seriously. Serious people do not run away from accountability. Then he uncovered the phone and went right back to laughing, dismissing me with a gesture that made my cheeks burn. I walked out of his office and felt something shift inside me. Not anger yet, more like a crack in a belief. Over the next year, I started noticing patterns. It was never a big thing at first. Small pieces of paper, a line in a report, a signature request that arrived at my desk without context. My name would show up on a vendor authorization I had never seen. My name would be used on an internal policy memo that had been written by someone else. I would be asked to sign off on quarterly compliance statements after the fact. When I asked questions, people would get vague. When I pushed harder, they would get nervous. The strangest part was that the actual power never came with the title. I could not approve spending. I could not redirect budget allocations. I could not hire or fire. I could not even access certain financial dashboards without a supervisor granting permission. I was the responsible executive on paper, but in practice, I was a bystander. I tried to bring it up with Mom once. We were in the kitchen at home, just the two of us, the way it almost never happened. She was slicing apples for a pie, hands steady, face calm. I said, Mom, Dad keeps putting my name on things, but he does not let me see the numbers behind them. She did not stop slicing. Your dad knows what he is doing, she said. That was her favorite sentence. Your dad knows what he is doing. It was how she ended every conversation that might require her to take a side. But Mom, I said, what if something goes wrong? What if I get blamed? She glanced at me then, eyes soft but afraid. Tara, she said, do not make trouble. Just do your best. Do your best. Like that could protect me from paperwork. Lila, on the other hand, never pretended. One afternoon in the office kitchen, I was pouring coffee when she walked in. Phone pressed to her ear. She ended her call, then looked at me with that polite smile. You look stressed, she said. I set the coffee down. I am trying to understand why my name is on accounts I do not control. Leila shrugged. Dad trusts you, she said. It is a compliment. It did not feel like a compliment. It felt like being handed a live wire and told it was a necklace. I watched her walk out, heels tapping, shoulders relaxed, completely unbothered by the idea of responsibility. Because Leila did not carry responsibility. Leila carried the image. The moment the truth fully clicked for me happened in a conference room on rainy Thursday. We were reviewing a set of client renewals. Dad was in a good mood, joking with the company men, letting them laugh like they were friends. Ken was flipping through charts. Lila was talking about branding, about relationship, about keeping the client happy. Then one of the men from legal, a younger guy with nervous eyes, slid a contract toward Dad and said, "We need a responsible executive signature for the file before we submit." Dad did not even look at it. He nudged it down the table toward me. "Sign it, Tara." I stared at the page. It was for a client I had never managed. It included performance clauses I had not negotiated. It included penalties I had not approved. "David," I said quietly, "I have not reviewed this." Dad's smile did not falter, but his eyes hardened. "You do not need to review it," he said. "It is already approved." "By whom?" I asked. Dad's voice dropped slightly, still calm, but with steel underneath. "By me." The room went silent. Not awkwardly silent, warning silent. The kind of silence that tells you, stop now if you want to keep your job. I signed. But as I put the pen down, I finally understood what I was. I was not being trained as a successor. I was being positioned as a buffer, a name on paper, a responsible executive, a person who could be pointed to if something ever cracked, a person who could absorb blame while the real decision-makers stayed clean. That realization did not turn me into a victim. It turned me into someone who started watching with intention. I stopped asking questions out loud. I started asking them quietly. I learned which emails disappeared from threads. I learned which reports got edited before they reached the archive. I learned how to request copies of documents without triggering alarms. I learned to read the way people shifted in their chairs when certain numbers came up. I learned that Ken's nervousness was not about me. It was about what he knew and what he feared. I did not confront Dad again. Not then, because confronting Dad without a plan was like stepping into a storm with an umbrella. It made you feel brave for a second, and then it snapped in half and left you soaked. So I began to build something else. A quiet system of observation. A private record of what I signed, when I signed it, who handed it to me, who was in the room, what had been said right before the pen touched paper. I told myself it was just smart. Good leadership, risk management. But deep down, I knew what I was really doing. And now, sitting in my car on Christmas night with my breath fogging the windshield, I realized that day had finally arrived. I started the engine again, pulled away from the curb, and drove into the dark. Not with panic, but with purpose. The court was coming. Dad had promised that. I had been collecting my own promises for 8 years, and the next move was mine. I did not change anything right away. That was the first lesson I had learned the hard way. When you move too fast, people notice. When you act offended, they prepare. Silence, on the other hand, makes people sloppy. They assume you are still confused, still loyal, still hoping to be chosen. So I stayed quiet. The weeks after that realization felt almost normal on the surface. I showed up to the office on time. I answered emails. I sat through meetings where my name was mentioned as a formality and then ignored when decisions were made. David treated me the same way he always had. Firm, distant, occasionally approving when I solved a problem without asking too many questions. Lila floated through the building like she owned it, stopping by departments she barely understood, laughing with people who needed her goodwill. What changed was how I looked at the numbers. I started with the operating fund. It was a shared pool of money meant to smooth over delays, cover unexpected costs, and keep major contracts stable when something went wrong. On paper, it was boring. Small withdrawals, routine transfers, nothing dramatic. But when I pulled reports month by month instead of quarter by quarter, a pattern began to form. The fund never crashed. It just bled. Every month, there was a small shortfall. Not enough to trigger alarms, not enough to panic the board, just enough to notice if you were looking closely. I would see a line item marked temporary adjustment, another marked internal reallocation. The descriptions were vague, the way they always are when someone does not want to explain too much. I printed the reports and laid them out on my desk one afternoon. Stacks of paper fanned out like a bad hand of cards. When I lined them up by date, I could see it clearly. The money was leaving in a steady rhythm. I did not assume anything yet. Assumptions make you sloppy. Instead, I followed the trail. The reallocated funds were being routed through secondary accounts tied to smaller contracts. Not the flagship clients that kept the lights on, but the quieter ones. Regional distribution agreements. Short-term supply deals. Pilot programs that were easy to justify and easy to overlook. And every single one of them traced back to Lila. She had been given control over a cluster of smaller accounts early on, framed as a chance to prove herself. Dad called it leadership development. On the surface, it made sense. These contracts did not bring in massive revenue, but they were visible enough to look impressive on a resume. They were also forgiving. If something went wrong, it would not immediately threaten the company. At least, that was the story. The reality was messier. Lila's contracts underperformed, not disastrously, not all at once, but consistently. Missed targets, rising costs, vendors charging penalties, Delivery schedules are slipping. Nothing that made headlines, but enough to eat away at margins. Normally, that kind of performance would trigger reviews, audits, at the very least, uncomfortable conversations. But those conversations never happened. Instead, the losses were quietly offset by us. I sat in my office late one evening, the building mostly empty, the hum of the lights louder than usual. I had my laptop open, spreadsheets layered across the screen, each one telling a small part of the same story. Money leaving the operating fund. Money appeared just in time to cover shortfalls in Lila's accounts. Then new reports issued with the numbers smoothed over. It was clean. Too clean. I checked the audit schedules next. Major contracts were reviewed regularly, like clockwork. The big clients demanded it. Government standards required it. But the smaller accounts were reviewed less often, and when they were, the scope was limited. Enough to check compliance, not enough to dig. Lila's name never came up in audit summaries. Mine did. Any document that referenced operational risk or financial exposure listed me as the responsible executive. It did not matter that I had no authority to approve those transfers. It did not matter that I had raised questions early on and been brushed aside. On paper, I was the one who owned the outcomes. I did not confront Lila. I did not confront Dad. Confrontation would have closed doors. I needed them open. Instead, I started saving everything. At first, it was instinctive. An email here, a report there. I forwarded copies to a private folder under a bland name that would not draw attention. Internal metrics. Archived correspondence. Monthly summaries before and after adjustments. I made notes, too. Not emotional ones, factual ones. Date. Time. Who was present, who spoke, who signed, who handed me the pen. When I noticed a reallocation that covered a loss in one of Lila's contracts, I pulled the corresponding email chain. When I saw an audit report that skipped over a problem area, I saved the draft and the final version. When a compliance form landed on my desk already filled out, I noted who sent it and when. I did not draw conclusions. I did not label anything wrongdoing. I told myself I was just being thorough, diligent, careful. That was the truth, at least on the surface. The deeper truth was harder to admit. I was building a record because I knew how this ended. I had seen it before in smaller ways. A vendor blamed a supply issue they did not cause. A manager quietly reassigned after pushing too hard. Responsibility always flowed downhill, never sideways, never up. And I was downhill. There were moments when doubt crept in. Moment late at night when I wondered if I was being paranoid, if I was misreading the situation, if this was just how big companies worked. Dad had always said business was not personal. He said it so often, it sounded like a rule of nature. But then something small would happen, and the doubt would disappear. Like the afternoon Ken stopped by my office again, holding another folder, eyes darting to the hallway before he stepped inside. "Can you sign this?" he asked quietly. I took the folder and flipped it open. Another compliance acknowledgement. Another issue tied to a contract I had never managed directly. My name is already printed at the bottom. "Ken," I said, keeping my voice even. "Who prepared this?" He hesitated. "Finance," he said. "And who approved it?" I asked. He swallowed. "Your dad." I nodded and signed, just like before. But this time, I made a copy first. Or the meeting where Dad praised Lila in front of the board for her relationship-building skills, glassing over the fact that one of her accounts had missed targets 3 quarters in a row. When someone asked about the numbers, Dad redirected the conversation smoothly. Talk about long-term potential and brand presence. Then, in the same meeting, he turned to me and mentioned operational risks on major accounts. Risks tied to performance metrics that bore my name. No one questioned it. Why would they? The document supported him. I watched faces around the table. Some looked uncomfortable. Some looked relieved it was not them. No one spoke up. That was when I understood how protection worked in our company. It was not loud. It was not obvious. It was administrative. A shift here, a signature there. A narrative repeated often enough that it became fact. Lila was being protected, and I was being prepared. I did not resent her in the way people might expect. Resentment would have made this personal, This was structural. Lila played her role the way she had always played it. She smiled. She deferred to Dad. She let other people handle the unpleasant parts. The real power was Dad. He decided whose mistakes mattered and whose did not. He decided where the money went. He decided which names appeared on which documents. And he had decided long ago that if something ever broke badly enough to draw attention, it would not land on him. It would land on me. I kept watching. Meet after month, the same pattern repeated. The operating fund dipped slightly. A smaller contract stabilized. Reports were adjusted. My name appeared in the margins like a quiet guarantee. I started to see how careful it all was. No single transfer was large enough to raise suspicion. No single loss was dramatic enough to demand answers. Everything stayed just below the line. Until it would not. I knew that eventually something big would fail. That is how systems like this end. You can hide a slow leak for years, but all it takes is one real shock to bring the whole structure into the light. And when that happened, I knew exactly what Dad would do. He would point to the paperwork. He would point to the responsible executive. He would talk about accountability and leadership and hard choices. He would not talk about where the money had gone. I shut down my computer one night and sat there in the dark, listening to the buildings settle around me. I did not feel angry. I did not feel scared. I felt focused. I did not know yet which contract would be the one to break the pattern. I did not know when the pressure would become too much to contain, but I knew it was coming. And when it did, I wanted every piece of the truth ready, not to argue, not to accuse, but to lay it out exactly as it was, quietly, completely. Because the most dangerous thing you can do to someone who thinks they control the story is let them keep talking while you keep records. I gathered my files, locked my office, and walked out into the night, already planning how to keep watching without being seen. The bleed was still slow, but it was steady, and sooner or later, someone was going to notice. I did not need to know exactly when for the decision to become clear. The moment I accepted that the bleed was intentional, not accidental, everything else snapped into focus. This was not a problem to fix. It was a structure designed to fail in a very specific way, with a very specific name attached to it. Mine. If I spoke up too early, the outcome would be quiet, a closed door, a polite meeting, a reassignment framed as concern. My access would disappear overnight, and so would the paper trail. David was good at that. He never burned bridges loudly. He simply made them vanish. So I stopped thinking about stopping it. Instead, I let it keep happening. That was the hardest choice I had made up to that point. Every instinct I had been taught told me to correct errors, to flag risks, to protect the company. But this was not about the company anymore. This was about who would be standing when the lights came on. I started building what I called my private timeline. It lived nowhere near the company servers. It lived on an external drive that stayed locked in my apartment, backed up by copies I rotated weekly. It was not dramatic. It was meticulous. Every document had a date. Every email had a context note. Every transfer was mapped from source to destination. I tracked who initiated it, who approved it, who benefited from it. I noted when my name appeared and when it did not. Patterns emerged quickly once I stopped hoping they would not. Whenever one of Lila's contracts dipped below projections, money moved within days. Whenever those adjustments were made, my name appeared on a responsibility form within the same reporting cycle. Whenever auditors asked surface-level questions, Dad handled them personally, steering attention toward larger accounts that looked clean. I began to see how intentional the pacing was. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was sloppy. It was slow enough to feel normal, quiet enough to feel boring. That was the point. I tested my theory once, carefully. During a review meeting, I asked a simple question about one of Lila's underperforming accounts. Not an accusation, just a clarification. The room shifted immediately. Dad answered for her, smoothly, confidently, and then moved the conversation on. After the meeting, he pulled me aside. He did not raise his voice. He never did. He told me I needed to trust the process. He said family loyalty mattered. He said not everything needed to be escalated. What he did not say was more important. He did not deny the losses. He did not explain the transfers. He did not ask why I was asking. That told me everything. From that moment on, I stopped asking questions out loud. Instead, I practiced being invisible in meetings while being fully present. I listened to how Dad framed issues, how he described accountability, how often he used my name in connection with stability and oversight. I noticed when Lila avoided my eyes and when she did not. She knew too. Not everything, maybe, but enough. Enough to stay quiet. Enough to accept the protection without asking what it cost. Mom stayed out of it entirely. She always had. She showed up to events, smiled at clients, asked polite questions about work without wanting answers. Her silence was not malicious. It was practiced. The deeper I mapped the timeline, the clearer the endgame became. There was one contract that mattered more than the others. A large client, high visibility, long-standing, the kind of account that could not absorb quiet losses forever. I saw it in the projections months before anyone said it out loud. Rising costs, tight margins, less room to hide adjustments. When that contract stumbled, it would not be possible to smooth it over. There would be scrutiny, external scrutiny, the kind that demanded a name. I knew which name would be offered. I could have stepped away. I could have pushed back harder and forced a confrontation before that moment arrived. But doing that would have turned this into a personal dispute, not a documented reality. Dad would have framed it as insubordination. Lila would have been shielded. The company would have closed ranks, and I would have lost the chance to show the whole picture. So I made another choice. I leaned into the role they had assigned me. I continued signing responsibility acknowledgments. I continued attending meetings as the person listed on paper. I accepted the risk profile that was quietly being built around me, but I also made sure every decision that bypassed me was recorded. Every approval that skipped my inbox but landed on my desk afterward. Every moment where my authority existed only in hindsight. There was a strange calm that settled in once I committed to this path. I stopped reacting emotionally. I stopped hoping Dad would change course. I stopped wondering if Lila would come clean. I was not trying to expose them out of spite. I was preparing to stand exactly where they planned to place me and let the truth speak for itself. Late one night, I sat at my kitchen table, papers spread out in front of me, timelines aligned, connections clearly marked. For the first time, I allowed myself to think all the way to the end. I pictured the contract failing, the board meeting, the press, the legal review. I pictured Dad's face when he realized the spotlight was not behaving the way he expected. I did not feel fear. I felt ready. They were going to push me into the open. I could see it coming as clearly as a storm on the horizon. And instead of stepping aside, I decided I would stand still. If they wanted a public moment, I would give them one. If they wanted me to carry the weight, I would carry it straight into the light. I gathered the files, shut them away, and turned off the kitchen light. As I went to bed that night, one thought stayed with me, steady and unshaken. I would not dodge what was coming. I would stand exactly where they put me. The shift happened quietly at first, the way all the most dangerous things do. Calendars changed without explanation. Meetings I had attended for years suddenly conflicted with others I could not miss. Agendas arrived late or not at all. When I walked into conference room, conversations softened and then resumed only after I sat down, careful and incomplete. The contract everyone pretended not to worry about was the one that mattered most. It was our largest strategic client, a long-standing partnership that carried weight beyond revenue. Their logo opened doors. Their endorsement reassured lenders. Losing them would not just hurt profits, it would damage credibility. I had seen the warning signs months earlier in the projections. Margins thinning, costs creeping up, small penalties stacking quietly behind polished summaries. Nothing dramatic enough to panic over, but enough to make recovery harder with every quarter. Now those numbers were no longer buried. I heard about the first serious issue through an email I was not copied on. A junior manager forwarded it to me by mistake, then followed up with an apology that sounded rehearsed. The client had flagged performance concerns and requested a formal review. They wanted explanations. They wanted guarantees. They wanted names. The board meeting to address it happened on a Thursday afternoon. I knew because I saw the room booked on the shared calendar, then watched my access disappear within minutes. By the time I refreshed the page, my name was gone. I did not confront anyone. I did not ask why. I had already reached the point where exclusion confirmed more than inclusion ever could. Instead, I watched. David moved quickly once the issue was out in the open. He always did when the stakes rose. Closed-door meetings multiplied. The family attorney began appearing more often. Her presence normalized through repetition. Conversations shifted from operations to liability, from fixes to exposure. Lila stayed visible but untouched. She attended lunches with clients. She smiled at the staff. She talked about future initiatives in broad, hopeful terms. No one asked her about the numbers tied to her accounts. No one asked her why those accounts needed quiet support from shared funds. Those questions circled me instead. Ken stopped by my office one afternoon, pale and tense. He did not sit down. He told me the board wanted updated documentation for the strategic client file. He said they needed everything aligned in case of external review. I knew. He listed responsibility summaries, compliance acknowledgments, oversight confirmations, all documents with my name already printed at the bottom. I nodded and told him I would send copies by the end of the day. After he left, I locked my office door and pulled out my own files. I compared what they were asking for with what I had saved: drafts versus finals, internal notes versus official reports. The differences were subtle but consistent. The narrative had already been written. The only thing missing was timing. The lawyer began joining meetings I was still allowed to attend. She never addressed me directly. She listened. She took notes. She asked clarifying questions that framed responsibility in careful, legal language. She talked about risk mitigation and leadership accountability. Dad nodded along, calm and authoritative. He spoke about transparency. He spoke about learning from mistakes. He spoke about protecting the company above all else. When he mentioned my name, it was always in the same context: oversight, operations, responsibility, never authority, never make decisions. I started receiving emails late at night, requests for signatures that carried an urgency I had not seen before. They wanted things dated quickly. They wanted acknowledgments that confirmed awareness of issues that had not been shared with me in real time. I signed nothing without copying it first. At home, my dining table became a staging area. Files spread out in careful order. Timelines refined. Each document cross-referenced with meeting notes and email metadata. I was no longer just observing. I was preparing for translation because I knew how this would be presented. There would be a failure. It would be framed as cumulative mismanagement. The board would express disappointment. The attorney would recommend decisive action to demonstrate accountability. Dawood would speak about difficult choices, and my name would be offered as proof that leadership took responsibility seriously. The first formal notice from the client arrived 2 weeks later: a request for renegotiation terms, a warning about potential termination if performance did not stabilize. The language was polite but firm. Dad called a family meeting that night, not in the office, at home. Mom made dinner. Lila sat close to Dad, nodding at the right moments. The attorney was not there, but her influence hung in the air. Dad talked about the client in measured tones. He said the situation was serious. He said the board was concerned. He said external review was likely. He looked at me and said this would require strong leadership. I agreed. That seemed to please him. He said it might get uncomfortable, that there could be public scrutiny, that the company needed to show it was willing to act decisively. I listened without interrupting. I watched Mom stare at her plate. I watched Lila stay quiet. When Dad finished, he asked if I had anything to add. I said only that I would cooperate fully. That was exactly what he wanted to hear. After that, things accelerated. The attorney requested more documentation. The board scheduled additional sessions. I was formally removed from some discussions, under the explanation that they needed streamlined decision-making. What they really needed was distance. I began assembling my legal file in parallel with theirs, not to argue facts, but to preserve sequence. Who knew what, when, who acted, and who did not, where authority stopped and where responsibility continued. I consulted no one. Not a lawyer, not a friend, not Mom. This part had to remain clean. There was a strange loneliness in those days, moving through the office knowing exactly what was coming, and saying nothing. People sensed it. Conversations stalled when I entered rooms. Some avoided me entirely. Others offered awkward sympathy they could not explain. Lila remained insulated. Her contracts were never mentioned in connection with the larger failure. The money that had been moved to support them stayed invisible, absorbed into consolidated reports. Dad controlled the narrative tightly. He always had. The final board meeting before the contract review was scheduled for early morning. I was not invited. That alone told me where this was headed. Later that day, I received a message from the attorney asking me to prepare for potential testimony. Not a conversation. Preparation. I read it twice, then saved it. That night, I sat alone in my apartment and reviewed everything one last time. 8 years of quiet accumulation. Every signature. Every transfer. Every meeting where my presence had been symbolic rather than substantive. I did not feel anger. I felt clarity. They were about to make their move. Public. Clean. Final. And I was ready. I shut down my computer, placed the drive back in its case, and set it beside my bag. When I turned off the light, I felt steady. The contract was failing exactly as it had been designed to, and I was standing exactly where they wanted me, with everything I needed already in my hands. The courthouse smelled like old paper and disinfectant, the kind of place where emotions were expected to behave themselves, where stories were flattened into facts, and facts were weighed without regard for how they felt. I arrived early, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to let the space settle into me before anyone else arrived. I wanted my body to understand that I was not here to react. I was here to witness. I wore a dark coat, simple and structured, nothing that could be called fragile or dramatic. I had learned that women who look too polished are judged as calculating, and women who look too soft are judged as weak. I chose neutral on purpose. Neutral reads as credible. Outside the front steps, a small cluster of reporters waited, shifting their weight from foot to foot in the cold. Cameras rested on shoulders, lenses already uncovered. Microphones with station logos hovered like curious insects. I recognized one of the local news stations from past charity galas, the same station that had once filmed Dad shaking hands and smiling proudly, while talking about growth and community values. I kept my eyes forward and walked past them without slowing. No flinch, no waves, no comment. I had learned long ago that the first image people see of you often becomes the entire story. I was not going to give them fear, anger, or apology. Inside, the courtroom felt cooler, the air thinner somehow. Wood benches polished by decades of restless hands, high ceilings that made even quiet sounds carry. The low hum of whispered conversations rippled through the room as lawyers, organized papers, and observers took their seats. I sat at the table reserved for the defense, folding my hands calmly in front of me. My lawyer sat beside me, posture relaxed but focused, flipping through notes we had reviewed together more than once. There was comfort in that familiarity. Nothing in her binder was a surprise. Nothing on this schedule was unknown to me. Dad entered a few minutes later. He walked in with the same posture he used in boardrooms, shoulders squared, chin level, eyes scanning the room as if assessing its value. He wore a dark suit I had seen many times before, tailored just enough to suggest authority without ostentation. His expression was carefully constructed, concerned, burdened, the look of a man who had been forced into an unpleasant duty. Behind him came Lila. She followed one step back, close enough to signal loyalty, far enough to remain untouched. She looked smaller than she usually did, her confidence muted by the unfamiliar setting. She avoided my eyes entirely. When she sat beside Dad, she angled her body slightly toward him, a posture I recognized instantly. It was the same one she had used her entire life, the posture of protection. Golden child even here. Mom was not present. I had known she would not be. Courtrooms required choices, and Mom had spent her life avoiding those. When the judge entered, the room rose as one. The scrape of benches echoed briefly before settling. I stood smoothly, feeling the weight of the moment press down without bending me. When we sat again, the sound of wood against wood felt final, like a door closing somewhere behind us. The proceedings began the way these things always do, with language that sounded formal and balanced, but was carefully angled. Dad's lawyer spoke first. His voice was calm, practiced, designed to soothe rather than provoke. He talked about the company's history, its commitment to integrity, the difficult position Dad had been placed in. He spoke about family values, about the pain of holding one's own child accountable. He painted Dad as a reluctant but responsible leader, forced by circumstance to make a heartbreaking decision. I listened without reacting. Then he turned to me. He described my role in careful detail. Choose words that sounded substantial. Executive oversight, operations responsibility, leadership authority. Each phrase landed like a stamp, official and definitive. He spoke as if my presence on paper was the same as power in practice, as if titles automatically granted control. Dad sat beside him, hands clasped, head slightly bowed at the right moments. When my name was mentioned, Dad's shoulders tightened just enough to suggest regret. The performance was subtle and precise. He had practiced this version of himself for years. The lawyer went on to describe the contract failure. He spoke about losses, about reputational damage, about the need for decisive action to protect employees and stakeholders. He framed the situation as unfortunate but necessary. What he did not say mattered more. He did not mention the operating fund. He did not mention internal reallocations. He did not mention the smaller contracts that had been quietly underperforming for years. He did not need to. The story they were telling was clean and simple. A company trusted a young executive. That executive failed. The company acted. When it was my lawyer's turn, she stood without urgency. She did not raise her voice. She did not challenge the narrative head-on. Instead, she asked that the record reflect timelines and documentation. She requested that specific exhibits be entered into evidence. The judge nodded and began flipping through the materials. I watched his face carefully. At first, there was nothing. Neutral. Focused. Then his fingers slowed. He stopped turning pages. He leaned forward slightly, adjusting his glasses. Eyes narrowing, not in suspicion, but in curiosity. He looked down at the document again, then lifted his gaze. Not toward me, but toward Dad's lawyer. The silence that followed felt different from all the others that had come before it. This one was not awkward or confusing. It was attentive. The judge spoke calmly, his voice steady and clear. Why was her name already listed as the responsible executive years before? This contract showed any signs of failure. The words landed with a weight that shifted the room. For a moment, no one moved. Dad's lawyer froze, mouth slightly open, the practiced rhythm of his argument breaking apart mid-thought. He glanced down at his notes, then back up at the judge, as if the answer might materialize if he looked hard enough. I did not look at Dad right away. I felt it instead. The shift. The tension in the room changed direction. What had been aimed squarely at me now hovered uncertainly, searching for somewhere else to land. Dad's face tightened. Not enough for most people to notice, but I noticed. I had spent my life learning to read the smallest changes in his expression, the brief flicker of irritation, the loss of control he had not planned for. Lila's hands clenched in her lap. The judge continued, still calm, still precise. The documentation indicates that her designation predates the contract issues by several years. I am trying to understand the rationale. The room felt suspended, like everyone was holding their breath at the same time. Dad's lawyer cleared his throat. He began to speak, then stopped. He turned slightly toward Dad, just for a fraction of a second, a reflexive glance that said, "Help me." Dad straightened in his chair. For the first time since I had walked into that courtroom, I saw uncertainty cross his face. It was quick, almost invisible. But it was there, a crack in the certainty he carried so comfortably everywhere else. The judge waited. No one spoke. The reporters seated behind us leaned forward, sensing something had shifted, though they might not yet understand what it was. Pens hovered above notebooks. Cameras adjusted angles. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the table, my breathing slow and even. This was the moment I had prepared for. Not with speeches or accusations, but with patience. Dad opened his mouth. Then he closed it again. The silence stretched, thick and undeniable, wrapping around the room like a held breath. It pressed on everyone present, demanding an answer that no one seemed ready to give. And in that silence, for the first time, the story they had planned to tell no longer belonged to them. My lawyer did not rush to fill it. She waited, letting the weight of the judge's question settle fully into the room. That pause mattered. It gave the court time to feel that something was off, that the explanation they had been offered did not quite line up with the paperwork in front of them. Then she stood. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "with the court's permission, we would like to submit additional documentation that addresses the timeline you are asking about." The judge nodded once. My lawyer handed a thick folder to the clerk, who carried it forward. I watched as the judge accepted it, heavier than the others, bound neatly, abled simply. Timeline of responsibility and fund allocation. Dad's lawyer shifted in his seat. He tried to maintain composure, but his hands betrayed him, fingers tapping once, twice, before stilling. Lila's shoulders tightened. She stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. The judge opened the folder. The first pages were straightforward. Charts, tables, clean, unadorned. They laid out 8 years of designations, shows exactly when my name first appeared as a responsible executive, across multiple accounts. Years before the strategic contract ever showed signs of stress. The judge scanned them carefully. My lawyer spoke again, calm and precise. These documents reflect internal responsibility assignments made well before the contract in question experienced any performance issues. They demonstrate a pattern rather than a reaction. The judge looked up at Dad. His gaze was direct, not hostile, but firm. "Mr. McAllister," he said, "can you explain why your daughter was designated as responsible executive for these accounts so early in her tenure?" Dad cleared his throat. He began with language I recognized instantly. Corporate phrasing. Leadership development. Preparing the next generation. Giving young executives exposure. I listened without reacting. I had heard these words for years. The judge let him finish, then glanced back down at the documents. He turned a page. "This next section," he said, "details fund transfers. Please explain the operating fund reallocations reflected here." My lawyer stepped in again, careful not to sound accusatory. "These records show repeated transfers from the central operating fund into a series of smaller contracts over an extended period. Those contracts were managed by another executive." She did not say Lila's name yet. The judge followed the line with his finger. He stopped again. "These contracts," he said slowly, "were consistently underperforming, yet they did not appear to undergo formal audits at the same frequency as others." He looked up, this time directly at Lila. "Ms. McAllister," he said, "were you responsible for these accounts?" Lila's eyes flicked to Dad before she answered. It was a reflex she could not stop. "Yes," she said quietly. The judge nodded, then looked back at the folder. "The losses on these accounts," he continued, "appear to have been offset by funds drawn from the operating pool, funds that would otherwise support broader company operations." He paused. "Were you aware of these reallocations?" Lila swallowed. Her voice wavered just slightly. "Dad handled the finances," she said. "I focused on relationships and growth." The judge did not respond immediately. He flipped another page. The next section of the folder showed side-by-side comparisons. Raw reports, adjusted summaries, before and after. The differences were subtle but undeniable. My lawyer spoke again. "Your Honor, these with underperformance in the contracts managed by Ms. McAllister. They also show that responsibility for overall operational stability was assigned to my client throughout this period, despite her lack of budgetary authority." The judge leaned back in his chair, considering. He looked at Dad again. "Mr. McAllister," he said, "were these fund reallocations disclosed to the board as temporary measures to support specific accounts?" Dad hesitated. That hesitation lasted less than a second. But in a courtroom, a second can feel like a confession. "They were internal adjustments," Dad said, "within my discretion." The judge nodded slowly and repeated losses in certain accounts. Dad's jaw tightened. The language shifted. "We did not see them as losses," he said. We saw them as investments. The judge held his gaze. Investments typically include oversight and accountability, he said. Yet these accounts appear to have avoided scrutiny, while responsibility was consolidated elsewhere. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. My lawyer turned to me. "Ms. McAllister," she said, "can you confirm whether you approved these fund transfers?" I met the judge's eyes. "No," I said simply. "Can you confirm whether you had authority to approve them?" "No." "Can you confirm whether you were informed of these reallocations before they occurred?" "No." The judge nodded, making a note. He looked back at Dad and the board representatives seated behind him. "The documentation suggests that financial shortfalls were managed in a way that shielded certain executives from scrutiny while assigning formal responsibility to another," he said. "That raises questions beyond this contract failure." The word "beyond" hung in the air. Dad's lawyer shifted forward. "Your Honor," he began, "this hearing concerns a specific contract dispute. Broader internal matters are outside its scope." The judge raised one hand, stopping him. "When responsibility assignments and fund management directly inform the narrative presented to this court," he said, "they are very much within scope." He turned back to the folder. The final section detailed what I had suspected but never spoken aloud. A running total of the operating fund depletion over 8 years. Not catastrophic in any single moment. Significant in accumulation. My lawyer spoke carefully. These funds were not only used to stabilize company operations, they were used repeatedly to cover losses tied to the same set of contracts. The judge looked at Dad. "Were these reallocations also intended to offset performance issues in contracts managed by your other daughter?" Dad did not answer immediately. The room waited. Lila stared straight ahead, face pale. Dad finally spoke. "We made decisions in the best interest of the company." The judge did not argue with that. He simply said, "The best interest of the company does not negate the obligation for transparent governance." He closed the folder gently. There was no outburst, no raised voices, no dramatic accusation, just a shift in gravity. The judge leaned forward again. At this point, he said, "It appears that responsibility for systemic issues was assigned in advance, while authority and benefit were distributed elsewhere. That is a matter this court cannot ignore." Dad's shoulders stiffened. The controlled sorrow he had worn earlier slipped, replaced by something sharper. The board members behind him exchanged uneasy glances. My lawyer sat down. I remained still. I did not feel victorious. I felt grounded. The truth had not exploded. It had unfolded, page by page, year by year. The judge announced a recess to review the materials further. The gavel came down softly, but the sound echoed. People stood slowly. The room buzzed with low murmurs. Reporters leaned toward one another, already forming headlines that no one had planned. Dad did not look at me. Lila finally did. Her eyes were filled with something I had never seen there before. Not anger, not superiority, fear. As the court emptied, I stayed seated for a moment longer, hands folded, breathing steady. Everything I had carried quietly for 8 years was now out in the open, not as an accusation, but as a record. The silence that followed felt different from the one before. This one belonged to the truth, and it was not finished speaking. The judge did not raise his voice. He did not scold. He simply looked at Dad the way a person looks at a document that suddenly does not match the signature at the bottom. Dad's lawyer tried again, softer this time, as if lowering his tone could lower the danger. He spoke about succession planning, about standard governance practices, about how companies sometimes list responsible parties in advance for continuity. The judge held up a hand. "I am not asking about continuity," he said. "I am asking why her name appears as the responsible executive on paper years before she had the authority to control budgets, approve transfers, or direct strategy." Dad's lawyer blinked. He looked down at his binder, then backed up. His lips parted, then closed. He was searching for a sentence that would not corner his own client. The courtroom stayed quiet. but the quiet had changed. It was no longer the polite silence of people waiting their turn. It was the kind of silence that feels like someone just turned on a bright light. Dad finally spoke. He leaned forward slightly, hands still clasped, voice steady. He did not look at me when he started. He looked at the judge. He kept his face composed, almost gentle, like he was explaining a hard truth to someone who did not understand what leadership required. "Your Honor," he said, "the company is not a toy. It supports families. It supports employees. When a crisis hits, someone has to stand up and take responsibility. That is how you protect the business." The word responsibility came out like a polished coin he had used too many times. The judge did not flinch. He looked down again at the documents, then backed up. "And you decided that someone would be your daughter," he said. Dad hesitated, just long enough for the point to land. Then he gave a small nod, as if the answer was obvious. "I decided that the company needed a clear chain of accountability," he said, "and Tara was part of that chain. Part of that chain. Not the leader, not the decision maker, just part of the chain, like a link you can replace when it breaks." My lawyer stood. "Your Honor," she said, "may I ask Dad a clarifying question?" The judge nodded once. My lawyer kept her voice calm. "Mr. McAllister, when you listed Tara as responsible executive, did you also grant her authority equal to that responsibility?" Dad's eyes flicked toward her. His expression stayed smooth. "Authority is earned," he said. "Tara was young. We gave her exposure. We gave her guidance." "Did you give her control of the operating fund?" my lawyer asked. Dad's jaw tightened. He did not like the specificity. "No," he said. "Not at that time." "Did you give her authority to approve internal transfers?" my lawyer continued, "including the reallocations shown in the submitted exhibits." Dad's lawyer shifted as if to object, then stayed still. He could feel the judge watching. "No," Dad said again. "So you gave her the responsibility without the authority," my lawyer said. Still calm, still steady. "And you put that on paper years before any public sign of failure." Dad leaned back, exhaling through his nose. The performance of sorrow returned for a moment, but it looked thinner now. "It was for the company," he said. "That is what you are not hearing. Someone had to be accountable." The judge leaned forward. "Accountable to whom?" he asked. "To the board? To the client? Or to the narrative you needed when something went wrong?" David's face changed then, almost imperceptibly, a flicker of irritation. Not fear, not guilt, irritation. Like the judge was wasting time on a question that should have been settled already. "We needed stability," Dad said. "We needed to reassure people. The company cannot survive if there is chaos at the top." My hands stayed folded, but inside, something tightened. Not anger, not surprising. Something colder. A recognition that this was not new. This was simply the first time he had said it out loud in a room where it could not be cleaned up later. The judge turned his attention to Leela. "Ms. McAllister," he said, "these accounts under your management show repeated losses. Can you explain the cause?" Lila's face went pale. She swallowed, eyes darting toward Dad, then back to the judge. Her voice came out softer than I had ever heard it. "Markets shifted," she said. "Some clients changed priorities. It was a tough environment." The judge nodded slowly, then tapped the folder. "Yet the losses appear consistent over multiple years," he said. "Not a single tough quarter, not a temporary downturn. Repeated shortfalls. Meanwhile, funds from the operating pool were used to offset them." He looked at her carefully. "Were you aware that those offsets were happening?" Lila's fingers twisted together in her lap. "Adam handled the finances," she repeated, almost word for word, like she had practiced it. I focused on the client side. The judge did not push her to confess. He did not need to. The record was already doing the talking. He turned back to Dad. "So," he said, "your younger daughter had her name attached to responsibility. Your older daughter had recurring losses, but no comparable accountability, and the operating fund was used to cover those losses." He paused. "Tell me why the court should accept the argument that this contract failure rests primarily on Tara. Dad's lawyer opened his mouth, but Dad raised a hand slightly, stopping him. David wanted to answer this himself. He always did when the stakes were high. He believed his voice could shape reality. Dad looked at the judge and spoke in the same tone he used at board dinners, when donors were watching. Because she was the one in the role, he said. Someone had to represent operations. Someone had to be the point of contact for responsibility. That is how corporate structures function. My lawyer did not react. She simply took a breath and asked the question I had been holding in my chest for years. Mr. McAllister, she said, did you ever tell Tara that you had listed her as responsible executive as early as you did? Dad's eyes flicked toward me, and for the first time since he walked in, he held my gaze. No, he said. The word was clean, simple, unapologetic. Did you ever explain why? My lawyer asked. Dad's expression stayed calm. He looked almost bored by the question. Because it was not her business to question governance, he said. I was her dad. I was her employer. I made decisions. She had a job to do. The courtroom stayed silent. There was no shouting, no dramatic outburst. Just that cold clarity. I made decisions. You did not get to ask. My lawyer turned slightly, letting the judge see her face. Your Honor, she said, that is the point. The designation was not a developmental opportunity. It was a shield. It placed legal responsibility on Tara without giving her power. It gave the company someone to point to if anything ever surfaced. Dad's lawyer finally stood, voice tight. Objection, he said. Speculation. The judge looked at him, unimpressed. It is not speculation when it is documented, he said. He turned another page. This designation appears repeatedly. It remains in place even when other leadership roles shift. It remains in place even when Tara is excluded from major meetings. It remains in place while funds move in ways she does not approve. He looked at Dad again. Why? Dad's lips pressed together. For the first time, he looked slightly cornered, not because he had no answer, but because the honest answer made him look exactly like him. He gave it anyway. Because the company needed protection, he said, and because she could handle it. He could handle it, as if I had been built for this, as if clean. The judge's voice softened, but it did not become kind. You listed her as a responsible executive before the failure, he said. You limited her authority. You allowed losses elsewhere to accumulate without direct scrutiny, and now you bring her into court as the face of failure? He paused. That looks less like governance and more like planning. Dad's shoulders lifted slightly, a defensive movement. Planning is what leaders do, Dad said. You prepare for worst-case scenarios. I felt something settle into place inside me, something I had avoided naming for years. It was not just that Dad had underestimated me. It was that he had decided, quietly and consistently, that I was expendable. Not in one moment, not in one argument, not in one cruel Christmas dinner. Over 8 years of placing my name where consequences would land. 8 years of letting me believe I was being trained while making sure I would be the one standing under the falling debris. I looked at Dad, really looked at him, and I realized something that should have broken me but did not. He was cold. He believed this was normal. He believed this was what families like ours did. They protected the legacy, even if it meant sacrificing one of their own. Lila, she had no story that fit the numbers. She had charm, connections, and excuses. But she could not explain repeated losses without exposing what Dad had covered for her. The judge turned toward the board members seated behind Dad. Who approved the continued designation of Tara as responsible executive, he asked. Who reviewed these assignments annually? One of the board members shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting toward Dad. Another looked down, as if staring at the floor could make them invisible. My lawyer did not press them yet. She did not need to. The judge was doing it for her. You will all understand, the judge said, that this court is not interested in a family story. It is interested in accountability. If a corporate structure was used to assign risk to one person while shielding another, that is material. Dad's lawyer swallowed hard. Dad's face held, but I could see the muscles in his jaw working. The judge looked down at the file again, then back up, voice quieter now. "Mr. McAllister," he said, "did you believe your daughter would simply accept this?" Dad did not look away. "Yes," he said, "because she always has." The words hit harder than anything else he had said, because they were true. I had accepted it for years. I had accepted the subtle exclusions, the shifting meetings, the quiet reassignments, the way my work was used and my authority was denied. Not because I was weak, because I was watching, because I was building a record, because I knew, eventually, someone would ask the question that made his neat story collapse. The judge sat back slightly, his expression unreadable. He looked at my lawyer. "Ms.," he said, "we will proceed with the next phase of your submission. I want the full timeline entered into the record." My lawyer nodded. Dad's lawyer sat down slowly, like he had suddenly realized he was no longer in control of the room. I stayed still, feeling the truth of it settle fully. I had not been betrayed in a moment. I had been assigned, and now the court was finally seeing the assignment for what it was. When the judge called for a brief recess, the gavel came down softly. People stood in a slow ripple. The reporters whispered urgently to one another, already reshaping their headlines. Dad did not stand right away. Neither did Lila, and I remained seated for one extra beat, letting my breath out quietly, because the hardest part of the story was no longer mine to carry alone. When the judge returned from recess, the room felt different. Not louder, not tenser, quieter in a way that comes after something irreversible has been set out. Loud. People sat straighter. Papers were handled more carefully. Even the air seemed heavier, like it had absorbed everything that had already been revealed and was waiting for what came next. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked directly at the file in front of you. Him. Not at Dad, not at me, not at the lawyers. When he spoke, his voice was steady, procedural, stripped of drama. Based on the documentation submitted and the testimony provided, he said, "This court finds that Ms. McAllister cannot be held personally responsible for the contract failure under review." The words landed quietly, but they landed deep. I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in years. Not because I had won anything, but because a weight I had been carrying without realizing it was finally being set down. The judge continued, "The evidence suggests that responsibility assignments did not align with authority and that material decisions occurred outside of Ms. McAllister's control. As such, personal liability is removed pending further review." Dad's lawyer stiffened. Lila's head snapped up just slightly. The judge did not stop there. Given the broader governance concerns raised, this court is ordering an independent audit of McAllister's supply group, internal financial practices, including fund allocation, responsibility designations, and oversight mechanisms. A murmur rippled through the room. Independent audit. That phrase did more damage than any accusation ever could. The judge went on to outline the scope. External reviewers, full access, historical review covering multiple years, board involvement, compliance reporting. It was not dramatic. It was devastating. Adam sat perfectly still, his face composed, but his eyes no longer held that familiar certainty. He was doing the math in his head, calculating what this would expose, how far back it would reach, how many quiet adjustments would suddenly become visible. Lila's hands trembled slightly in her lap. She stared straight ahead, blinking too fast. The judge concluded by stating that further proceedings would follow pending audit findings and that no public attribution of fault should be made beyond the court's current determinations. The gavel came down. Just like that, the room shifted again. People stood slowly. Conversations broke out in hushed tones. Lawyers leaned in toward their clients. Reporters moved with renewed urgency, already framing what they had just witnessed. My lawyer leaned toward me and whispered that we were done for the day, that I was free to go. Free. The word felt strange, unfamiliar, like something I had heard other people talk about, but never quite claimed for myself. As I stood, Dad finally looked at me, not with anger, not with sorrow, with something closer to calculation, as if he were reassessing an asset that had not performed as expected. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left for him to say that mattered. Outside the courthouse, the reporters surged forward. Microphones extended. Cameras flashed. Questions were shouted over one another. About family, about betrayal, about scandal. I did not stop. I walked down the steps and kept moving, my lawyer close beside me, the cold air sharp against my face. For the first time, I did not feel the need to explain myself to anyone. The truth was already working on its own. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They never do. At first, it was quiet. A press release from the company stating that it would cooperate fully with the audit. Language about transparency. Commitments to governance. Carefully chosen words designed to reassure without admitting anything. Dad remained CEO, at least on paper. Lila continued to show up to the office, though her presence had changed. People watched her now. They noticed things they had previously ignored. The audit team moved in like a slow tide. Requests for documents, interviews scheduled, old emails resurfaced, drafts compared to finals, patterns traced. The operating fund became a focal point. Transfers that had once been invisible were now examined in sequence. Questions were asked about why certain contracts had required repeated support. Why did those contracts belong to the same executive? Why audit triggers had not been activated. Board members who had once nodded along began to ask harder questions, not out of moral awakening, but out of self-preservation. Nobody wanted to be the next name attached to a failure. Clients noticed too. The strategic partner whose contract had sparked the case announced it was reviewing its relationship with the company. Other clients followed suit, not leaving immediately, but watching more closely. Trust, once shaken, does not return quickly. The company's reputation took a hit. Not a collapse, not a scandal splashed across every headline, but a steady erosion. The kind that makes lenders nervous and partners cautious. Dad felt it. I knew he did, even before he said anything. He called me one evening, weeks after the hearing, the first time he had reached out directly since Christmas. I watched my phone ring on the counter for a long moment before I answered. His voice sounded tired, not broken, just worn down by resistance. "You did not have to do it this way," he said. I almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. "This was the way you chose," I said calmly. He was quiet for a moment. "The audit is damaging the company," he said. I closed my eyes. The old instinct to apologize twitched and then faded. "The company damaged itself," I said. "I just stopped carrying it." He did not argue. That was how I knew something had truly changed. Lila did not call. I heard about her through other people, that she was struggling to explain losses under direct questioning, that she was defensive in interviews. She cried once during a meeting and left early. For the first time, she was being asked to carry weight without protection, and she was not built for it. As for me, I stepped back, quietly. I declined interviews. I avoided public statements. When asked if I would return to the company once the audit concluded, I said only that I was focusing on my next chapter. That answer confused people. They expected anger, revenge, a triumphant return. They did not understand that I had already reclaimed what mattered. My reputation remained intact. Not spotless, not celebrated, but solid. People who mattered knew the truth. They had seen the documents. They had watched the hearing. They had noticed how the narrative shifted. I received calls from former colleagues, from industry contacts, from people who had once dismissed me quietly. Conversations changed tone. Opportunities surfaced. Not because I demanded them, because I had demonstrated something rare. I had stood in the place designed for my downfall and not collapsed. There was no celebration, no moment of vindictive joy, just a steady sense of relief. The kind that comes when you realize you no longer have to explain yourself to people who never listened. The audit continued. Findings were issued. Recommendations made. Governance structures revised. Names moved around on paper. The damage could not be undone. Dad remained in charge for a while longer, but his authority had thinned. Decisions were questioned. Oversight increased. The board no longer deferred automatically. Lila's role shrank. Quietly, gradually. She was reassigned, then reassigned again. No announcement, no confrontation, just the slow rebalancing of reality. Karma did not rush. It did not strike with lightning. It arrived through a process, through documentation, through the kind of truth that cannot be shouted down. I moved forward without fanfare. I found space to breathe, and for the first time since I was a child, I felt something close to peace. Not because everything had been fixed, but because I was no longer the one absorbing the damage. I had stepped aside at exactly the right moment, and the rest was finally out of my hands. That understanding did not feel dramatic. It felt like a quiet click, like something inside me finally locking into place. For the first time since I was old enough to understand expectations, I was not waiting for a call, a meeting, or a verdict to tell me who I was allowed to be. The court process continued without me in the room. Auditors requested documents. Lawyers traded careful language. Reports were drafted, challenged, revised. Names were rearranged on paper the way they always are when accountability starts moving uphill instead of down. I followed none of it closely. I did not need to anymore. What surprised me was how quickly people assumed I would come back. The first suggestion came from someone on the board, delivered indirectly through a mutual contact, who asked if I might be open to a quiet conversation. We met in a small cafe far from downtown, the kind of place where nobody wore suits and nobody asked who your father was. He spoke carefully, like a man trying not to offend a wild animal he did not fully understand. He talked about healing, about balance, about how important it would look if I returned once things stabilized. Not to lead, he clarified, to advise, to help guide a transition. I listened, nodded politely, thanked him for thinking of me, and said I would consider it. I already knew the answer, but I had learned not to rush the truth out loud. Some people need to hear themselves speak first. Dad called me a few weeks later. I watched my phone light up on the kitchen counter while I finished washing a mug. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Then I dried my hands and answered. His voice sounded older, not fragile, but worn, like someone who had spent too many nights explaining things that could not be fully explained. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge the damage in emotional terms. That was not how he operated. He spoke about practicality. The company could benefit from your experience, he said. There is trust there. You have credibility. I looked out the window while he spoke, watching a delivery truck struggle to parallel park on the street below. Ordinary life moved on without regard for any of this. I told him I was not coming back. There was a pause. You are walking away from a legacy, he said. I answered calmly. I am choosing a different one. He did not argue. That was how I knew the conversation was over. After the call ended, I stood in my kitchen longer than necessary, listening to the quiet. I waited for the familiar surge of guilt, the instinct to explain myself better. It did not come. Instead, there was relief. Not joy, relief. I realized that for the first time, my choices did not require approval from a room I was never meant to win. I stepped fully into my own work after that, consulting at first, then more structured projects. I worked with companies that wanted systems cleaned up, governance rebuilt, trust restored from the inside out. I knew how fragile those moments were. I knew what happened when accountability was treated like a liability instead of a responsibility. I did not trade on my story. I did not tell clients who my dad was or where I came from unless it mattered. Most of the time, it did not. What mattered was that I showed up prepared, calm, and clear, that I asked the questions people avoided, that I understood how power moved, even when nobody admitted it out loud. My reputation followed me quietly. People called because someone else had mentioned my name in a sentence that included words like steady, or thorough, or fair. No one called because they felt sorry for me. No one called because they thought I had been wrong. They called because they trusted me. That mattered more than anything I had ever inherited. Every so often, something from my old life brushed past me. A headline about restructuring. A former colleague sent a careful message to say they hoped I was well. A holiday season where invitations arrived thinner and later than they used to. I noticed the absence. and then I let it go. Mom reached out once, months later. We met for lunch at a quiet restaurant halfway between our neighborhoods. She looked tired, like someone who had spent decades smoothing over sharp edges until there was nothing left of her own hands. She asked how I was doing. I told her the truth, that I was learning how to live without bracing myself. She nodded. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. She said she was proud of me, softly, like the words were I took them without asking her to say more. That was enough. David and I settled into a polite distance. Cards on birthdays. Short calls on holidays. Conversations about us to admit what had been lost. Some people would call that cold. I call it honest. I did not walk away in anger. I did not walk away to punish anyone. I walked away because staying would have required me to keep shrinking in ways I could no longer survive. For years, I had been told I was too quiet, too accommodating, too willing to absorb discomfort. People mistook my patience for weakness. They assumed my silence meant consent. They were wrong. My silence had an observation. It had been pattern recognition. It had been a long decision, forming slowly until it could no longer be undone. I did not win by destroying my family or watching them fall apart. I won by refusing to be buried under choices I did not make. I won by leaving clean. That does not mean unscarred. It means I chose not to bleed where I built my future. I no longer introduce myself as someone's daughter. I no longer measure my worth against approval that was never freely given. I build my days now with intention. Work that aligns with my ethics, relationships that do not require me to disappear, boundaries that do not need constant defense. That is what justice looks like to me. Not revenge, not triumph, just the quiet certainty that I told the truth when it mattered, and I did not abandon myself to make others comfortable. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.